Go ahead.
All right. Good morning, everyone. For our presentation, we chose the Gayle Wells Foundation for early onset Alzheimer's and care. For this presentation, we're going to give an overview of the foundation, who it serves, what they do, the type of grief felt by these clients. Little
Hey,
overview.
Eleanor, sorry, real fast. Can anyone else not see the slides? Does it just look like a big yellow background to anyone else?
It does. That's what it looks like. Yeah.
Weird.
Yeah, it's not like presenting.
What?
There you go. I see it now.
What if I did like this? Present. Is it gone now?
Give me 1 second, it's loading. But now it just, I think looks, here, click to the next slide to like 3. It just looks white. Maybe just present it from the
From this
Canvas
view?
screen.
Or if
Yeah.
somebody else wants to share their screen, because I don't know if it's me. I can do it from here though. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. Well, on to the overview. Okay. So the Gayle Wells Foundation for Early Onset Alzheimer's is a nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness and providing support for those affected by early onset Alzheimer's disease. They believe that early onset Alzheimer's is not who someone is, it's what they have. And they list their core values as love, generosity, encouragement, trust, integrity, loyalty, resilience, spirituality, respect, and dignity. So the population served here. So obviously early onset Alzheimer's patients. What is early onset Alzheimer's? It's defined as Alzheimer's disease being diagnosed prior to the age of 65. And this can occur as early as their 30s, 40s, and 50s. However, it's not limited to those with early onset Alzheimer's dementia. They also serve those with other forms of early onset dementia, such as alcohol-induced dementia. And also, they do not have to have an official diagnosis because notoriously it's very hard to get a diagnosis for this disease. And oftentimes those with early onset aren't diagnosed until they're into the late stages of the disease. And then also they provide care to family and loved ones, children and teens, because oftentimes these patients might still have kiddos in school kind of thing, who don't qualify for bereavement support groups kind of thing because their parent has not passed yet. And then also support for caregivers and care partners. So services provided, care consultation and planning. So this is one-on-one individualized care plans and resources. This is sort of case management. Laura will meet with clients and families separately. There's no brick and mortar for the facility. So she literally meets them where they're at. If they need Zoom, she'll go to Zoom. If they're in Sugar Land, she'll go to Sugar Land, that kind of thing. And she walks with them through every step of the disease. So prior to diagnosis, during diagnosis, looking for memory care facilities or kind of figuring out if there's a hospitalization that's happening, that kind of thing. And there's also a death doula program called Compassionate Transitions. I'm not going to talk much on that because my colleague Cara will be doing so in a minute. Support groups offered. Currently, there is one for the partners of clients that meets monthly over Zoom. They also offer a ton of education, training, and resources. There's a foundation newsletter with updates on the disease, research, and treatment. There's articles on it, and also a bunch of really helpful checklists and tip sheets for those caring for someone with early onset Alzheimer's or early onset dementia. And then upcoming, they're talking about launching in August their Death Cafe program, which is the idea to combat the culture of death in our society by providing a safe space in which those who wish to discuss death and dying can do so as a part of a group-directed discussion each month. Okay, and for our interview, we interviewed Laura Sutherland, who is the founder and executive director of Gayle Wells Foundation. Formerly, she worked as a director of conventions, but she returned to school at the GCSW because she's a GCSW alum after her partner Gayle passed. So who is Gayle Wells? Laura met and became Gayle's partner in 1987. And in 2001, Gayle had been diagnosed and battling several bouts of cancer. She was on her third bout of cancer when she started exhibiting symptoms of memory loss and memory concerns, but they were written off by doctors as side effects of medication, cancer treatment, and what have you. But at the age of 51, Gayle was officially diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And when she received that diagnosis of early onset, Laura did everything she could to learn about the disease, but couldn't find a lot of information for individuals under 65. And so as Gayle's care partner, Laura experienced firsthand the gaps in education, information, knowledge, and services available. And so through this experience, she knew that she had to create this foundation because she never wanted anyone to go through what she and Gayle did, and made it her mission to study everything about the disease.
Yeah, so as Eleanor mentioned, one of the things that they do at the Gayle Wells Foundation is death doula work. I had heard loosely about death doula work, but never really understood what it entailed until we were having this conversation with Laura. And I found it so interesting. So I wanted to share it in the hopes that maybe others would also find it interesting, where the idea of compassionate transitions is that, especially for populations where you've been diagnosed with a terminal illness, or you know that death is coming for like a long period of time, you can do some of this preparation work. And even if it's sudden, if you do this work in advance, then people know how to treat you in those last stages of your life. So some of the things that Laura mentioned about the vigil planning element. So for example, if you are in hospice care and you're potentially in the last couple of days of your life, which typically hospice workers know is happening, some of the things that they can do if you answer these questions and work through this process is talk about what colors you want in the room where you are, what people you want. Maybe there are certain people who want to be there, but that you don't want to be there. And that's something that you can express. What sounds do you want to be playing? What temperature do you want the room to be at? Do you want a lot of flowers? Do you not want flowers? What do you want the lighting to be? It's just like, do you need a spiritual leader there? I think the idea of asking these questions, or questions I've never asked myself, but also questions that I think really center the person who is going to pass, instead of, the assumptions of the people around them. And it allows them to have agency in their own transition process. So I thought that was really powerful. Another thing that she talks about that I think really resonated when we're talking about the nature of caring for someone who is diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease is that they're care partners. So actually, if we go to the next slide where we talk about the literature review, the fact that all of the literature almost exclusively talks about caregivers and not care partners. And something that Laura mentioned in our interview was that care is a two-way process, right? It's not just one person giving and one person taking, in part because that can make the person who has the diagnosis feel incredibly infantilized and powerless in their own life, and like they're not contributing anything anymore. And so the phraseology of care partners, just in that small little verbal shift, can be really powerful for the way that people feel about themselves. So there was literature that talked about this, not a lot, as Eleanor mentioned. The type of loss can be challenging because of the gradual nature. So for example, as Eleanor mentioned, the fact that children can't necessarily get off for bereavement, we as a society really prioritize emergent loss and immediate loss. And when it's something like early onset Alzheimer's disease or related diagnoses, it happens over such a prolonged period of time that we don't really have mechanisms to care for people as they experience that type of loss. And then the populations involved, I mean, pretty self-explanatory. It's folks that may experience these unique challenges because of the prolonged nature of the grieving process. The caregivers, care partners, are also really, wrapped up in when we're talking about who's experiencing this grief, right? And then the younger age is, of course, a complicating factor for example, children who are grieving potentially a parent who died while they were still children themselves, and they don't necessarily have the tools or the vocabulary to process their grief. Can you go to the next slide? Mm-hmm. So some of the special needs, like I talked about, are the complications and obstacles that not only the people who have been diagnosed face, but also their care partners. So care partners oftentimes, because of the culture we create in society, face social stigma about seeking support and having support groups, which is part of why what the Gayle Wells Foundation does is so important, is that it provides a space not only for those experiencing the diagnosis, but also for their care partners to seek support and community. Some of the other special needs are this lack of access, right? This lack of resources. I mean, the Gayle Wells Foundation is a relatively new organization and it has a relatively small capacity. Its mission is wonderful, but a lot more people face this diagnosis or face symptoms without getting a diagnosis and then don't have access to these resources and to the support. And that can complicate the act of healthy grieving. And so those are some of the contributing factors also to complicated grief: the younger age, care partners experiencing burdens of care, and feeling this sort of prolonged nature of guilt and fatigue and emotional exhaustion, because this isn't oftentimes a short process, right? It's years. And care partners, like Laura herself, get thrust into this role without necessarily the tools or the coping mechanisms to process what this work will entail. So yeah, that's the literature review. I'll pass it over to Cameron now.
Right. Thank you. So now that we discussed like the complicated nature of early onset Alzheimer's disease and how the care partner and the individual with the disease kind of goes through that, I want to talk about the different types of grief that can come from as early as the diagnosis or onset of the symptoms and then past the individual's death when they succumb to the disease. So one of the first types of grief that we think about is anticipatory grief, and this is experienced by both the individual and their care partners. So this can look like anticipating the loss of normalcy in their lives, and like the loss of functioning for the individual, and then eventually the loss of that person with the disease. So that's where like the death doula program comes in, and that's why it's so important for them to just be, you can never be like prepared for somebody's death, but being more comfortable with like the anticipation of it. And then we have disenfranchised grief can also appear just because of the lack of understanding that many providers and people have. Like we were saying in the literature review, there isn't a lot of literature, so even providers don't know how to approach this type of grief, and that can cause the people receiving that treatment feeling disenfranchised in their feelings. And this is worse for people in minority populations because, again, that just adds another layer of misunderstanding and not feeling like they are getting appropriate treatment. And then there's ambiguous loss as well. That goes back to the loss of normalcy or functioning, and this is not seen as like typical loss or that immediate loss that Cara was talking about. And again, it can happen in like varying amounts of time. There isn't like a generalized way to go about treating people with early onset Alzheimer's. It can happen a lot faster than people think or a lot slower. So it's just very ambiguous on how to go about treating people. And then lastly, there's post-death grief. So that's once the individual succumbs to their disease. And this is the type of grief we may be more familiar with. But in the interview, Laura said that, like, again, no matter how much you prepare for somebody's death, they're never ready to let go. So it's important for Gayle Wells specifically to be there for that care partner once the individual on and continue services with the care partners as they need. And this can also be disenfranchised grief on top of the post grief they're already feeling, because people, again, they think if you're anticipating this death that you'll be able to handle it better, you should move on faster. So if they're not feeling that support from outside support systems, then that can lead to disenfranchised grief. Okay, so how does Gayle Wells tackle these different types of grief. Laura mentioned specifically Wolfeld's companioning. And this is a humanistic person-centered approach that involves being present with the person who's grieving, acknowledging their pain, listening with empathy and compassion, and providing support without fixing or solving grief. So again, it just goes back to how no one grief journey is the same, and you can't really create a structure around it. So just being with that person, very client-led treatment. And there are 11 tenets of companioning. I'm not going to sit here and read all of them, but I want to include 3 that stood out to me. So just companioning is about honoring the spirit. It is not about analyzing with the head. Again, that is just like not generalizing. And then it's bearing witness to the struggles of others. It's not about judging or directing these struggles. And it's also about walking alongside. It is not about leading or guiding them through this process. And so how Gayle Wells and specifically Laura applies this theoretical approach. She does the client-led companioning, obviously with the individual and the partner, and that's just focused on supporting treatment when the clients are ready and willing to engage, and not telling them that they should be ready or telling them what they need, and just allowing them space to talk and process through everything they're feeling. And again, because Laura has her own experience with early onset, it might be easy for her to put her own narrative on the clients. So she needs to, one of the things she said is like she makes sure to like stand with the clients and not insert her own feelings into the story, which is also goes back to the part of companioning where you don't judge, and you're not guiding, you're just along with the journey. And then again, with the flexibility of companioning, she meets with both the care partners and the people individually and as a pair. So it kind of just depends on what they need at that moment, and it's flexible in the treatment. So it's not like once a week all the time. It can be just whenever they need that extra support. And like the key focus of all of her treatment is that she never wants to say that there's nothing else that we can do for you, because I hear that from so many different places already, like hospitals, because there's no treatment or cure for Alzheimer's. That's what they're hearing all the time. So that's one of the things that Laura makes sure to never say to her clients, so they don't feel like that hopelessness, that there's no one there for them. And I'll pass it over to Esme.
Thank you. Yeah, so now to talk a bit about a grief treatment plan based on that theoretical framework and treatment approach that Cameron touched on. A treatment plan should really be based on that principle of companionship and really being present through each of those grieving stages. So some specific interventions that would be appropriate for this framework and approach that they have would be the Gestalt techniques, which is Gestalt therapy is a form of psychotherapy that is centered on increasing a person's awareness, freedom, and self-direction. So including that in individual therapy with the person that is diagnosed and their family members. Also remnants therapy, which is an intervention that specifically for older patients really provides them with a sense of fulfillment and comfort as they reflect and look back on their lives. And then finally, grief therapy for the patient's family members 3 to 6 weeks after their death. And the overall goals of this treatment would be, like we've touched on already, to prepare their care partners or caregivers and family members to support them through each of those different phases of grief, considering that all of them might be in different stages of their grief. Reflecting on the person's or the patient's life and its meaning. And then finally, also relieving some of knowns, relieving some unanswered questions and stress factors at each step of the process from the point of diagnosis all the way to death. Next slide, please. And so for social work implications, we wanted to touch on some of them. The first one, which is very important and that we've touched on throughout our presentation, is having a comprehensive understanding of the disease. Like we've talked about, not a lot of people are very aware of what it looks like, how to treat it, how it can be diagnosed. So that's very important when providing care and working with this population. Also having awareness on the existing barriers for this population. For example, for those that are not able to afford care, being open to engaging with other cultures and different practices. So we've talked about how Gayle Wells does a very good job of incorporating those cultural and traditional aspects for each patient and their family members, their loved ones. So making sure that the treatment and care that we're providing incorporates that. Understanding the complexity of working with patients, their loved ones, and how each person involved is going to be at a different stage. And then finally, engaging in advocacy work to bring more awareness to early onset Alzheimer's disease, and sharing that knowledge so that more people are aware of the characteristics and what it looks like. And so to conclude, we have 3 points that we really want to emphasize. The experience of early onset Alzheimer's disease for the individual and their care partners involves many different types of grief. To better serve this population and their care partners, we should actively seek out appropriate and culturally tailored care so that we're able to provide them and with the support that they feel most comfortable with. And then finally, working with patients and their loved ones really requires a deep understanding of the disease and how each individual involved in care is affected in their own way. And these are our resources. Thank you for listening.